The morning started like any other Tuesday for Marcus Chen. His alarm went off at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his official wake-up time, which gave him exactly enough time to mentally prepare for the day. He'd been doing this for 3 years, ever since Sarah left. The ritual helped him feel in control of something, anything. He lay in bed in his modest two-story craftsman house in the Rosewood Valley neighborhood, listening to the sounds of his dog, Duke, stirring downstairs. The German Shepherd had a sixth sense about Marcus's wake-up routine, which was equal parts comforting and slightly unnerving. Some mornings, Marcus wondered if Duke was his dog or if he was Duke's human. Marcus pulled himself out of bed and went through his morning routine with the precision of someone who'd constructed his life around predictability. Shower, coffee, check his work emails from home before heading to the office at his IT consulting firm. By 7:30 a.m., he was downstairs with Duke, letting the dog out into the backyard while he reviewed contracts on his laptop at the kitchen table. Duke bounded out into the yard with the kind of enthusiasm only a 4-year-old German Shepherd could muster. The dog had been a refuge, honestly. After the divorce, Marcus had thrown himself into work and created a hollow shell of a life. Duke had changed that. The dog demanded presence, demanded engagement, demanded that Marcus show up for something other than himself. The backyard was Marcus's pride. 3 years ago, when he'd bought the house, it was a disaster. Overgrown grass, a sagging fence, and a concrete patio that looked like it belonged to a Soviet apartment complex. Marcus had spent 18 months and a considerable amount of money transforming it. The crowning achievement was the pool, a modest but elegant rectangular pool with a deck that wrapped around 2 sides and a small pergola in the corner that he was still finishing. He'd learned to do most of the work himself, watching YouTube videos, calling contractors for the technical stuff, and pouring his heart into every detail. The pool had been empty for 2 weeks. Marcus was waiting on a new filtering system to arrive before he filled it. The contractor had promised it would come Friday. Marcus had triple-checked the order confirmation. Duke made his usual rounds, sniffing the fence line, investigating the corner where a family of rabbits lived in the neighbor's yard, and then settling into his favorite spot under the pergola where the morning sun filtered through the lattice in a patchwork of light and shadow. Marcus watched his dog for a moment, then returned his attention to the laptop. There was a contract that needed revision, and his boss was expecting notes by 9. His coffee was getting cold. Life moved on with its relentless momentum. He didn't think about his neighbor. Nobody really thought about Karen Whitmore, if they could help it. Karen lived in the house directly behind Marcus's, a white colonial with black shutters that was worth approximately 4 times what Marcus's house was worth, though Marcus had never done the math and would have found it depressing if he had. She'd moved in 18 months ago with her husband, David, who was frequently absent due to business travel. Karen had spent the intervening time becoming the neighborhood's most volatile presence. There were the complaints about Marcus's fence being too rustic for the area's aesthetic. There were the passive-aggressive texts to the neighborhood association about his yard work happening on Saturday mornings. There was the incident where she'd called the police because Duke had barked during an afternoon nap time she'd scheduled for herself, something Marcus had learned about only when an officer showed up at his door, looking tired and apologetic. She was the kind of person who seemed to believe that the world owed her something it was refusing to pay. Everything in her life was everyone else's fault, and every slight, real or imagined, was a personal attack worthy of nuclear-level retaliation. Marcus had learned to let her noise wash over him. He had a therapist who called it healthy boundary setting. Marcus called it ignoring the problem until it went away. It usually did. What he didn't know on that Tuesday morning was that Karen Whitmore had a problem of her own, one that was about to make Marcus's life much more complicated. Karen had discovered that her husband was having an affair. She'd found the text messages 3 days ago, stupid, careless messages on a tablet David had left on the kitchen counter. Messages that were unambiguous, detailed, and deeply humiliating. The woman's name was Jasmine. She worked at David's firm. She was younger, of course, they always were. The rage had come first, that primal white-hot fury that made Karen want to smash things. She'd thrown a vase. She'd screamed until her throat hurt. She'd called David 17 times, and when he finally answered on call number 18, she'd unleashed 3 years of accumulated anger and resentment in a 40-minute monologue that she was sure had scarred him for life. David had then done the one thing that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. He'd left. Not just for work. He'd packed a bag and gone to a hotel, telling Karen he needed time to think. He told her they should probably see a marriage counselor. He told her in his infuriatingly calm and clinical way that this was nobody's fault, and these things happen, and we need to have a serious conversation about our relationship. Karen had wanted to kill him. Since she couldn't, she decided to destroy something else. She decided to destroy her life. It started small. She'd checked into a hotel herself for a night, spending money David didn't know about. She'd bought herself a diamond bracelet on a credit card she'd hidden from him for years. She'd done things that were petty and self-destructive, the financial equivalent of slitting her wrists and watching the blood drip. But these things had brought her no joy. They'd brought her only the hollow satisfaction of knowing that David would eventually see the charges and understand that she was suffering, that she was retaliating, that she wasn't the kind of woman who would just accept his betrayal with grace. The problem was that David didn't care. He'd barely flinched at the credit card charges. He'd asked if she'd get an itemized bill so they could discuss dividing the assets fairly. Fairly. As if fairness was possible when her entire world was falling apart. It was during the third day of David's absence, sitting alone in the kitchen of the house that suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to their failed marriage, that Karen had noticed something. Marcus's pool, or rather the lack of it. She'd been staring out the kitchen window, the one that overlooked the fence line between their properties, and she'd noticed that his pool was empty. She knew it was newly built. She'd been infuriated when he'd installed it, viewing it as a direct insult to her own backyard, which featured a small inflatable hot tub that had never worked properly, and a lawn that her landscaper had told her would never support a pool due to soil composition issues, or some such nonsense. But looking at his pool now, empty, waiting like a chasm in the earth, Karen felt something shift in her mind. She'd been thinking about the pool for hours before she admitted to herself what she was actually thinking. She wanted to go in it. Not in a rational, well-adjusted way, but in a way that felt like the next domino in a chain of self-destruction that had started the moment she'd found those messages. Because if she was going to be the kind of person whose husband was unfaithful, she might as well be the kind of person who trespassed on her neighbor's property. She might as well be reckless. She might as well be desperate. Karen had spent a lot of time cultivating respectability. Yoga classes, charity board meetings, a white colonial with black shutters, carefully curated social media presence, designer clothes, the right sunglasses, the right handbag, the right mask. What good had it done her? So when David texted on Tuesday evening to say he wouldn't be home that night either, that he was going to stay at a client's house upstate, and would they please table this discussion until Wednesday, Karen made a decision. She put on her Tory Burch swimsuit, the expensive one she'd bought in Dubai 3 years ago and rarely wore because it showed her stomach, and she was worried about her stomach. She put on her designer sunglasses, the ones that cost $400, and made her feel like she was in a movie where she was the protagonist of her own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. She wrapped herself in a silk cover-up. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, she scaled the fence between her property and Marcus's. She moved quickly, driven by adrenaline and that particular kind of recklessness that comes when you've decided you have nothing left to lose. The fence was only about 5 feet tall. Marcus kept it intentionally low because he liked the feeling of openness, of not being walled off from the world, which Karen had always found irresponsible and pretentious. She landed on the other side in Marcus's yard, her heart pounding, every nerve ending alive with the electricity of doing something forbidden. The yard was quiet. The sun was sinking below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus's house was dark except for a single light that looked like it was in the kitchen. She could see his car in the driveway. He was home. That thrilled her in a way that she didn't fully understand. The danger of it, the possibility of being caught. She approached the pool slowly, her footsteps silent on the grass. She was aware of every detail, the way the air smelled like cut grass and the jasmine flowers that grew along the fence line, the way the shadows were lengthening across the pristine concrete deck, the way her heart was hammering in her chest so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The pool was empty, just as she'd known it would be. The bottom was clean, Marcus kept it covered when it wasn't in use. She climbed down the ladder and sat at the edge of the deep end, letting her feet dangle into nothing, into the empty space that should have been water. This is crazy, she thought. This is absolutely insane. And then, with a deliberate motion that felt like jumping off a cliff, she decided to fill the pool. Not with water, that would take hours and require the hose and make noise, but with herself, with the reality of her violation. She slipped off her cover-up, removed her sunglasses, and dove into the empty space. Her body hit the concrete floor of the pool with a sickening crack. Pain exploded through her shoulder and her hip and her ankle. She lay there in the darkness at the bottom of Marcus's empty pool, gasping, tears streaming down her face, wondering what she was doing with her life. She'd been lying there for perhaps 5 minutes, alive but broken, when she heard the sound that would change everything. The sound of a dog barking. Marcus was still at his laptop when Duke started barking. Not his usual warning bark, the one he used when rabbits were in the neighbor's yard or when the mail carrier was approaching. This was something different. This was urgent. This was an alert bark, the kind Duke reserved for real problems. Marcus looked up from his laptop. Duke stood at the sliding glass doors that led from the kitchen to the backyard, his entire body rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on something in the darkness beyond the deck. "What's up, buddy?" Marcus called. Duke barked again, more insistently. This was unusual. Duke was generally a calm dog, well-trained and responsive to Marcus's commands. He wasn't an excessive barker. In fact, Karen had only called the police about the barking that one time, which Marcus had always felt spoke to the unreasonableness of her complaint. One barking incident being escalated to law enforcement was objectively absurd. Marcus set down his laptop and joined Duke at the glass door. The backyard was mostly in shadow now, the sun having dipped below the fence line. The light from the kitchen cast a rectangle of illumination across the deck, but beyond that was darkness and the pale concrete shape of the empty pool. "What do you see?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Duke's barking stopped. He whined a high-pitched sound of distress and pawed at the door. Marcus's instincts said, "Open the door. Let the dog out." Whatever Duke was alarmed about probably needed to be addressed. Marcus had learned to trust his dog's instincts over his own human tendency toward inaction and avoidance. He unlocked the sliding door and stepped aside. Duke shot out into the backyard like he'd been fired from a cannon. "Duke, what the—" Marcus started, but the dog was already moving, bounding across the deck and toward the pool. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from the drawer by the sink. He kept one there for exactly this kind of situation, prepared as always, and followed Duke outside. The beam of the flashlight caught the pool first. It caught the empty concrete bottom. It caught something else. It caught a person. Marcus's brain didn't process this information correctly at first. His conscious mind rejected it. His backyard didn't contain people. His pool didn't contain anything. This was a carefully controlled space where Marcus understood all the variables. "What the—" he started again, moving closer. Duke had already reached the pool. The dog was whining, circling, clearly distressed by what he was seeing. The flashlight beam found a face. Karen. Karen Whitmore lay at the bottom of Marcus's empty pool, partially on her side, one arm stretched out as if she'd been reaching for something. Her expensive swimsuit was covered in dust from the pool floor. Her face was pale, twisted in pain. There was blood on her forehead where she'd struck the concrete. For a long moment, Marcus simply stood there. His mind was creating a narrative at the speed of light, running through possibilities and landing on the only one that made sense. Karen had climbed into his yard uninvited and thrown herself into his empty pool. Which was crazy. Which was completely insane. Which was exactly the kind of thing Karen would do to destroy him if she had the opportunity. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "Help," Karen called from the bottom of the pool. Her voice was thin and reedy, nothing like the commanding tone Marcus was used to. "I'm hurt. I fell." Marcus moved to the pool's edge without quite thinking about it. Duke circled back to him, pressing against his leg, still whining. "What are you doing in my pool?" Marcus asked, calling down to her. "I fell," Karen repeated. "Please, it hurts, my shoulder. I think I broke something." "What were you doing in my backyard?" Marcus asked. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant, disconnected. "Marcus, please, I'm hurt. I need help." He could call the police. He could call 911 and let them handle this. Whatever had happened here, whatever had led Karen to trespass on his property and throw herself into his empty pool, it was above his pay grade now. It was above his capacity to understand. But looking at her lying at the bottom of his pool, bleeding in pain, Marcus found himself incapable of the cruelty it would take to just let her suffer. Whatever their conflicts, whatever her past behavior, she was a human being in need of help. He climbed down the ladder into the empty pool. It was strange being in the structure from this perspective. Usually he thought about the pool from above, from deck level, imagining what it would look like filled with water. Now he was inside it, surrounded by walls, looking up at Duke, who was still packing back and forth around the pool's edge. Corinne made a sound that was half gasp, half sob as Marcus approached her. "Don't move," he said. "I don't know what's broken. Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere," Corinne breathed. "My shoulder, my hip, I think my ankle is. I can't feel my left foot properly." Marcus examined her in the light from the flashlight he'd propped on the side of the pool. There was a gash on her forehead, bleeding but not catastrophically. Her shoulder was hanging at a slightly odd angle, could be separated, could be dislocated. The real question was whether there was any spinal damage. "I'm going to call 911, he said. "Don't move, try to stay as still as possible." "Okay," Corinne said. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I'm sorry." Marcus pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed. The 911 dispatcher was clinical and efficient. Yes, an ambulance was on the way. Yes, he should try to keep her immobilized. Yes, German shepherds were indeed alert animals. Yes, this was quite unusual. While they waited for the ambulance, Marcus tried to piece together the story. Corinne must have climbed the fence between their properties, probably during the time he was focused on his laptop. She must have decided, for reasons he couldn't fathom, to trespass on his property and get into his pool. And then, in the darkness, she'd fallen into the empty concrete basin. What he didn't understand was the why. Why would someone do this? Why would you climb into your neighbor's pool intentionally? "Why did you come into my backyard?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle, trying not to sound accusatory. Corinne was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. "I wanted to know what it felt like," she said. "To be somewhere else, to be someone else, just for a moment. I wanted to be free." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. He found his anger at her dissolving, replaced instead with something like sadness. Sadness that Corinne was so unhappy she'd scaled a fence and trespassed on her neighbor's property in the hopes of finding some kind of escape, even if that escape meant throwing herself into an empty pool. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later, lights flashing against the evening sky. Paramedics flooded the backyard, professional and quick. They had a spine board, they had equipment, they had protocols. Within minutes, they were lifting Corinne out of the pool with professional efficiency. Marcus stood to the side, Duke pressed against his leg, and watched as the woman who'd made his life miserable for the past 18 months was loaded into an ambulance. Her eyes found his as they were lifting her, and there was something in that moment, a flash of shame, a moment of clarity, a recognition of how far she'd fallen and how much damage she'd inflicted on both of them in the process. Then the doors closed, and the ambulance was gone, leaving Marcus standing in his backyard with his dog, wondering what came next. He would find out very soon that next came in the form of Detective Patricia Hayes, who would arrive at his door with questions and a warrant to review the security footage he'd installed as part of his obsessive renovation project. Because Corinne had landed exactly in the one spot where his new camera, meant to monitor the pool during construction, had a perfect view of everything. Detective Patricia Hayes was in her early 50s, with the kind of face that suggested she'd spent a significant portion of her life not believing anyone about anything. She sat at Marcus's kitchen table on Wednesday morning, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of her, while her partner, a younger man named Detective Sullivan, stood near the refrigerator looking at Marcus's home security photos. "Walk me through it again," Hayes said. Marcus had walked through it 3 times now. The story didn't change because it was true, simple, and unambiguous. He'd been working, Duke had alerted, Marcus had investigated, Marcus had found Corinne in the pool, Marcus had called 911. "I've told you everything," Marcus said. "I don't know why she was in my backyard. I didn't invite her. I have no idea how she got past the fence." Scaled it, Sullivan said from across the room. We found scuff marks, fabric fibers, definitely climbed over, and she admits to it, so that part's straightforward. There's just one thing that's bothering me, Hayes said, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten because he recognized that tone. It was the tone of someone who'd noticed something everyone else had missed. The timing. What timing? Marcus asked. Your dog, Hayes said. You told me he alerted to something, and that's what made you go out. Your dog activated some kind of alarm system. No, Marcus said. He just barked. He's a smart dog. He knew something was wrong. Hayes exchanged a look with Sullivan. The thing is, Hayes continued, we've been reviewing the events of the last 18 months. Corinne's complaint about your dog barking, the noise complaint to the HOA about your yard work, multiple instances where she's attempted to create problems for you. And now she shows up on your property in the evening, gets into your pool, and injures herself badly enough to require hospitalization. It was an accident, Marcus said. Was it? Hayes asked. The question hung in the air between them. Meaning what? Marcus asked carefully. Meaning she could have been trying to hurt herself, Hayes said. And she could have been counting on your property as the place to do it, or she could have been trying to create the appearance of you allowing her onto your property. Or, and this is what's bothering me, your dog could have been alarmed for a reason that has nothing to do with her presence in the pool. Marcus felt cold. You think she did this intentionally, to blame me for something? I think, Hayes said slowly, that I'd like to see your security footage. You said you have cameras set up. Marcus had indeed set up cameras, 3 of them. One pointed at the pool area from the patio, one covering the backyard in its entirety from the corner of the house. One pointed at the back gate. He'd installed them during the renovation to monitor the contractors and to prevent theft, which had been happening in the neighborhood. He'd immediately provided the footage to the police when they'd first arrived. Detective Hayes had reviewed it then, briefly, while standing in the backyard. But she was asking to see it again, which meant she'd been thinking about something specific. Marcus pulled up the security footage on his laptop. The file was dated for the previous evening, 7:43 p.m., which was when the motion sensor had triggered the camera to start recording. The footage showed the pool area in question. It showed the concrete deck, the empty pool, the fence line. It showed shadows lengthening across the pavement as the sun set. And then at 7:51 p.m., it showed a woman climbing over the fence. But not the fence between Marcus's property and Corinne's. The fence on the other side of the property. The fence between Marcus's yard and the property of his other neighbor, Tom Hendricks, who lived in the house to the north. The woman was not Corinne Whitmore. Even in the grainy security footage, it was unmistakably clear that the woman climbing over the fence was younger, smaller, and significantly more athletic than Corinne. She wore dark clothes and moved with purpose. She walked directly to the gate that led from Marcus's backyard to the front driveway, opened it with a key card, and let herself inside. Then the footage showed her walking around the pool, examining it carefully, moving toward the pergola, and checking the small storage shed where Marcus kept his pool equipment and garden tools. This went on for approximately 5 minutes. The woman seemed to be cataloging something, taking inventory, possibly planning. Then at 8:02 p.m., she climbed back over the fence and disappeared. 15 minutes later, Corinne appeared at the fence, scaled it in a far more clumsy manner, and proceeded to fall into the pool. Hayes and Sullivan watched the footage in silence. Well, Hayes finally said, this is interesting. That's not Corinne, Marcus said, stating the obvious. No, Hayes agreed. That is definitely not Corinne. That's someone with a key card and knowledge of your property. That's someone who appears to be either casing the place or looking for something specific. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. He'd been assuming Corinne's appearance in his pool was some kind of impulsive mental health crisis related to her personal life. The discovery of another woman on his property, moving with purpose and intention, suggested something far more complicated. I don't know who that is, Marcus said. Well, Hayes said, we're going to find out, because this is now officially a breaking and entering investigation, in addition to your neighbor's unfortunate accident. And if I had to guess, I'd say your neighbor's accident might not have been as accidental as we initially believed. You think Corinne came over here intentionally to, what? Get hurt. I think, Hayes said carefully, that we have two crimes potentially connected. Someone entered your property unlawfully. Your neighbor then entered your property unlawfully, and she ended up with serious injuries. That's a complicated equation, and I need to understand all the variables." She stood up, her partner immediately following suit. "We're going to need you to think carefully about who that woman might be," Hayes said. "Does that person look familiar to you?" Marcus shook his head. "I have no idea. I've never seen her before." "Well, let's hope the resolution on this footage is better than it looks," Hayes said. She handed him a card. "If you remember anything, or if you have any other security footage that might help us identify her, call me. And Mr. Chen, try not to leave town." After they left, Marcus sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the frozen image on his laptop screen. The image showed the unknown woman, paused mid-stride as she examined his pool. He opened his laptop and began searching through all his security footage, going back months. He watched hundreds of hours at fast-forward speed, looking for any sign of this woman on his property. It took him 3 hours, but he found it. She'd been here before, multiple times. Always in the evening, always moving with purpose, always using that key card to access the gate. The first visit had been 7 weeks ago. Marcus felt sick. Someone had been systematically accessing his property, and he'd had no idea. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him pick up. "Marcus," a woman's voice, familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "This is Jasmine Chen." His ex-wife. "Hi," he said, confused. "Has it been that long? You can just use your old key card, you don't need to." "I haven't been to the house in 6 months, Jasmine said. "But apparently someone has been using my key card, the one I gave back to you after the divorce." The pieces began clicking into place, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. "You didn't give it back," he said quietly. "I kept looking for it, and you said you'd already turned it in." "I did give it back," Jasmine said. "To you, in person. You were standing in this kitchen, and I put it in your hand, and you put it in your pocket. That was in June." Marcus started, but he had no explanation. He'd kept the key card, he'd forgotten he had it, but he'd definitely kept it. Which meant someone else had stolen it, or he'd lost it, or it had fallen out of his pocket and someone had found it. "Marcus, I got a call from the police. They're asking about my key card. They seem to think I've been entering your property without authorization. I need to know what's going on." Marcus told her about the footage. He told her about the woman. He told her about Karen and the pool and the detectives. Jasmine was quiet for a long moment. "That's not me," she said finally. "I don't know who that is, but Marcus, if someone's been using my key card and if they've been planning something, you need to call the police back immediately." After Jasmine hung up, Marcus sat in his kitchen and realized he'd been living in a house that wasn't as safe as he'd believed. Someone had been accessing his property. Someone had been planning something, and he'd had no idea. Duke came and rested his head on Marcus's knee, as if to say, "This is exactly why I was barking." Marcus scratched the dog behind the ears and made a decision. He called Detective Hayes. "I have something you need to see," he said. "Security footage going back months, and I think I might know who the woman is." He didn't know yet, of course, but he was about to find out. The woman's name was Victoria Zhang. She was Jasmine's younger sister. She was 28 years old. She worked in property management. She had access to security key cards through her job, and according to the police investigation that followed, she had been systematically entering Marcus's property for the better part of 2 months in what appeared to be a long-term planning process for a break-in. Detective Hayes delivered this information to Marcus on Thursday morning, while Victoria Zhang sat in a holding cell, pending charges of breaking and entering and intent to commit burglary. "Can I ask why?" Marcus said to Hayes, who'd come to his house to update him in person. Her partner, Sullivan, stood nearby, attempting to appear disinterested but clearly interested. "Ms. Zhang claims she was acting on behalf of your ex-wife," Hayes said, consulting her notes. "She says Jasmine told her you had some personal items that belonged to her, items of significant sentimental value. She was authorized, according to Ms. Zhang, to retrieve these items. She was not authorized to commit a break-in, obviously, but that's what she claims." "That's insane," Marcus said. "Jasmine wouldn't do that. We had lawyers. We split everything fairly." "We know," Hayes said. "Ms. Chen corroborated your story. She denies any involvement or authorization. Ms. Zhang is now claiming she misunderstood her sister's requests. It's a mess. What was also a mess was the fact that Jasmine had subsequently called Marcus, mortified and furious. She'd had a screaming fight with her younger sister over the phone, had threatened to cut her off permanently, and had begged Marcus to believe that she had nothing to do with the break-in attempt. Marcus, reviewing the timeline, understood that Jasmine was telling the truth. But that left him with a different problem. "What does this have to do with Karen?" Marcus asked. "Why did Karen go into the pool that night?" "That's the interesting part," Hayes said. She pulled out her phone and showed him a transcript. "Mrs. Whitmore gave a statement to the hospital's social worker before she was discharged. She said she'd been having a mental health crisis related to marital troubles. She said she'd climbed the fence to her neighbor's property with the intention of trespassing in the pool because she wanted to feel like she was doing something reckless and dangerous. She said she wasn't paying attention when she climbed down into the pool. She fell." "So it was an accident," Marcus said. "Yes," Hayes said. "A very dramatic accident that happened to occur on the same evening that a woman was breaking into your property. But yes, separate incidents." "Except they're not separate," Sullivan said, speaking for the first time. "Because if Karen hadn't fallen into the pool, if she hadn't injured herself badly enough to call an ambulance, we wouldn't have been called to this address. We wouldn't have reviewed your security footage. We wouldn't have caught Victoria Zhang in the act of planning a felony." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Karen's mental breakdown had potentially saved his house from being robbed. Karen's intentional trespass and accidental injury had been the domino that knocked everything else over. "Is she okay?" Marcus asked. "Karen, the hospital said she'd be discharged today." "Separated shoulder, fractured ankle, concussion, various bruises," Hayes said. "She's going to be in pain for a while, but she'll recover." After the detectives left, Marcus sat in his kitchen and thought about the sequence of events that had led to this moment. He thought about Karen, alone in her white colonial, discovering her husband's infidelity. He thought about her mental breakdown, her reckless decision to trespass in his pool. He thought about Jasmine's younger sister breaking into his house. He thought about how close he'd come to waking up to a burglary without knowing who'd been planning it. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Marcus, it's Karen. I got your number from the neighborhood directory. I'm at home now. I wanted to apologize. Can we talk?" Marcus's first instinct was to ignore it. Karen had caused him nothing but grief for the better part of 2 years. He had no obligation to speak to her. He could delete the message and pretend he'd never received it. But he found himself texting back, "Yes, when?" "Now, if you have time, David's not home. I'd prefer he doesn't know about any of this." Marcus understood. Karen wanted to contain the damage, to keep her husband from learning about her trespass and her accident and the humiliation of the whole situation, which meant she was asking him for a secret, asking him to be complicit in her fiction. He should have said no. Instead, he told Duke he'd be back in 15 minutes and walked around the fence to the white colonial with the black shutters. Karen answered the door wearing sweats and a t-shirt, her arm in a sling, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. She looked smaller than he remembered her, diminished by injury and shame. "Thank you for coming," she said. They sat in her pristine living room. White furniture, carefully curated art, a sense of controlled perfection that somehow felt more broken than any mess could have been. "Why did you do it?" Marcus asked directly. "Go into the pool, Karen looked out the window toward the fence line, toward the pool that had become the center of this strange drama. "My husband's having an affair," she said quietly. "I found out on Saturday. He left on Tuesday. I've been alone in this house for 2 days, thinking about everything I've done wrong to deserve this, thinking about every choice that led to this moment. And all I wanted was to feel something other than shame. So I thought maybe if I did something terrible, something reckless, I could, I don't know, transform it somehow. Make the pain into something I chose instead of something that was done to me." "By trespassing in my pool," Marcus said. "By doing something that would get a reaction," Karen said. "By proving that I was someone other than the woman whose husband was cheating on her. By being someone who would climb a fence and sneak into her neighbor's pool. By being someone brave enough to do something crazy." "That's not brave," Marcus said. "That's breaking and entering." "I know," Karen said. She turned to look at him, and there were tears streaming down her face. "I know it was wrong. I know I've been a terrible neighbor. I know I made your life difficult. I've been so angry for so long at everything and everyone, and I took it out on you because you were convenient, and because I thought if I could make you as miserable as I was, then my misery would mean something. Marcus sat with this for a moment. He understood the impulse, actually. He'd done his own version of it, shutting people out, constructing walls, creating routines that were designed to protect him from having to feel anything. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because I owe you an apology," Karen said. "Because I'm looking at my life and I'm realizing that I've spent the last 2 years being someone I don't want to be. Someone mean, someone bitter, someone who complains instead of connecting, someone who destroys instead of builds." She gestured around her living room, at the carefully curated space that suddenly seemed like a monument to a marriage that was falling apart. "My therapist says I used anger as a defense mechanism, that I was so scared of being hurt that I hurt people preemptively, that I was so afraid of being replaced by younger, more interesting people that I tried to make myself indispensable by making everyone else miserable." Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd expected Karen to deny responsibility or to blame David or to find some way to make this his fault. The honesty was disarming. "I don't know if this changes anything between us," Karen continued. "But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and I wanted you to know that I understand if you want to press charges or if you never want to speak to me again. But before you decide either way, I want you to know that you helped me. When I was lying at the bottom of your pool, breaking and alone and humiliated, you helped me. You called the ambulance. You didn't leave me there to suffer. You treated me like a human being instead of the horrible neighbor I've been." She pulled something from her pocket, a hospital bracelet. "They gave me this in the hospital," she said. "And when I was sitting in the emergency room waiting to be x-rayed, I made a decision. I decided to get help, real help. I'm starting therapy next week, actual therapy, not just the periodic sessions I've been doing. I'm going to talk to David about marriage counseling, though I suspect that's going to be too little too late. And I'm going to try to be a better neighbor, not because I think that will fix anything, but because I think I owe you that attempt." Marcus looked at this woman who'd made his life difficult, who'd complained about his dog and his yard and his very existence in the neighborhood, and who was now sitting in front of him in sweats and a t-shirt, broken and vulnerable and trying to change. "I'm not pressing charges," he said. "I assume the hospital reported the injury and the police will do what they do, but I'm not going to add to it." "Thank you," Karen said. "You should press charges," Marcus continued. "Not on yourself, I can't do that, but on David if you want to, for the infidelity. There's no legal charge for that, obviously, but there are divorce lawyers who can use it as leverage. There's financial compensation. There's vindication." Karen shook her head. "I don't want to hurt him the way he hurt me. I don't know. I want to move forward without carrying all this anger with me." Marcus nodded. He understood that impulse too. He understood it in his bones. Before he left, Marcus said something he hadn't expected to say. "There's a pool in my backyard. It's going to be filled in a few days. If you ever want to go swimming, actually swimming in the way that swimming is meant to happen, you can. No judgment, just water and sunlight." Karen looked at him like he'd offered her something infinitely valuable, which he supposed, in a way, he had. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of police statements and legal complications, and the slow realization that Marcus's quiet, ordered life had been disrupted in ways both large and small. Victoria Zhang pleaded guilty to breaking and entering. She was sentenced to 3 months in jail and 2 years of probation. During her sentencing, she attempted to explain to the court that she'd been acting on what she believed were her sister's wishes, but the judge wasn't particularly sympathetic to the distinction between intentional and unintentional crimes. Jasmine called Marcus several times, mortified and apologetic and furious with her younger sister in equal measure. By the third call, Marcus told her to stop apologizing. It wasn't her fault, and her guilt was starting to feel like a burden he was expected to carry, and he had enough burdens of his own. The divorce between Marcus and Jasmine was officially finalized, and while it wasn't acrimonious, it was thorough. Jasmine kept the condo she'd moved into after the separation. Marcus kept the house. There were no children, so there was no custody battle. There was only the quiet dissolution of a 7-year marriage into signatures on documents and the dividing of jointly owned assets. He was, at 35 years old, alone again. The neighborhood HOA actually apologized to Marcus. They sent an official letter acknowledging that there had been concerns about his property that were perhaps not entirely warranted, and that they were reviewing their policies regarding neighbor complaints and aesthetic standards. It felt hollow, but Marcus accepted it anyway. Corinne's recovery was slower than the doctors had initially predicted. The separated shoulder required physical therapy. The fractured ankle meant 6 weeks on crutches. The concussion meant headaches and sensitivity to light for several weeks. But she showed up to her therapy appointments and began the long process of reconstruction that comes when you realize you've been building your life on a foundation of anger and judgment. She also came to swim. The first time was awkward. Marcus had filled the pool, and it gleamed in the summer sunshine like something out of a magazine spread. Corinne showed up in a modest one-piece, moved carefully due to her still-healing injuries, and lowered herself into the water with a careful smile. "How is it?" Marcus asked from the deck. "Perfect," Corinne said, and she meant it. There was something in her expression, a lightness, a relief, that suggested the water was doing what she'd hoped the empty pool would do. It was offering her a space that felt separate from her real life, a place where she could be neither the angry wife nor the bitter woman, just a person floating in a body of water, supported by something other than her own will. After that first time, she came every other day. They didn't talk much, just a greeting and a farewell. Sometimes Marcus sat on the deck with a book or his laptop while Corinne swam. Sometimes he went inside. The important thing was that she'd been given access and permission, and by extension, she'd been given the chance to rebuild herself in a way that didn't involve destruction. Duke's role in all of this became legendary in the neighborhood. The dog had prevented a burglary by alerting to Corinne's trespass. The dog had summoned the emergency responders who'd found the woman in the pool. The dog had been instrumental in the entire chain of events that had led to Victoria Zhang's arrest. A reporter from the local news station reached out asking if they could do a feature story on the hero dog who stopped a crime, and Marcus politely declined. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want his trauma to become entertainment for other people's evening news. He just wanted his life back. But his life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. One evening, about a month after Corinne's accident, she asked Marcus if they could talk. They sat on his patio, overlooking the pool, as the sun began to set. "I'm getting a divorce," she said without preamble. "David and I have decided to separate permanently. I think I've known for a long time that we weren't happy, but I was too scared to admit it. Too invested in the idea of being a married woman to a successful man. Too comfortable with the life we'd built, even though the foundation was rotten." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, "even though it sounds like it might be for the best." "It is," Corinne said, "for both of us. David's already talking about moving in with Jasmine, which is its own special kind of irony, isn't it? The woman he was cheating with is sleeping with him in the apartment that used to be his marital escape when he was lying to his wife." Marcus winced. "That's rough." "It is," Corinne said, "but it's not my problem anymore, which is strange. For so long, everything felt like my problem. Everything felt like a threat or a failure or proof of my inadequacy. Now I'm realizing that a lot of it was just life. Messy, complicated life that was going to happen regardless of how much I worried about it." She pulled a letter out of her bag. It was thick, several pages long, written in careful handwriting. "I've written letters to everyone I've treated poorly," she said. "The mailman who used to avoid our street because I was rude to him, the HOA president who I sent angry emails to, the woman who runs the yoga studio after I had that incident where I complained about the music being too loud, and you." She handed the letter to Marcus. "You don't have to read it," she said, "but I needed to write it. I needed to apologize for the specific ways I've hurt people, not in a general "I'm sorry for being mean" way, but in a real way that accounts for what I did and how it might have affected them." Marcus took the letter but didn't open it. "Thank you," he said. "I'm also moving," Corinne said. "Not immediately, but once I get divorced and settle the finances. I'm thinking about something smaller. Somewhere that doesn't feel like a monument to my failed marriage. Maybe somewhere on the coast. Somewhere I can start over." "That sounds nice," Marcus said. "Will you miss me?" Corinne asked, and there was genuine vulnerability in the question. Marcus considered this. "I'll be glad you're doing better," he said finally. "I don't know if I'll miss you exactly, but I'll be grateful that you came into my backyard, fell into my pool, and accidentally changed my life." Corinne smiled. "See, that's grace. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to learn how to do, to see the unexpected consequences and the accidents and the terrible moments as opportunities for growth instead of personal attacks. After she left, Marcus opened the letter and read it alone on his patio with a glass of wine, and the sounds of the evening coming to life around him. It was an apology and a confession and a moment of genuine human connection. Corinne had written about the specific complaints she'd filed, about the anger that had driven them, about the realization that she'd been projecting her own unhappiness onto the nearest available target, which had been him. She'd written about his dog and his pool and his quiet presence in the neighborhood, and she'd acknowledged that he'd done nothing to deserve her ire. She'd written about how that night in the empty pool had been a kind of bottom, a moment where she'd had to face the reality of what she'd become. And she'd written about gratitude, which was the part that made Marcus cry. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in December, Marcus stood in his backyard and looked at the changes he'd made since that evening when Corinne had fallen into his empty pool. The pool itself was the same, carefully maintained, beautiful, a point of pride, but the backyard had evolved. The pergola was finished now, complete with climbing jasmine that would bloom in the spring. He'd added a small fire pit area with comfortable seating. He'd planted a garden that was now dormant for winter but would return in the spring. He'd created a space that was designed not for his solitary enjoyment, but for connection. Duke came out and sat beside him, the dog's presence as steady and comforting as always. "Good boy," Marcus said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You saved my house, you know that." Duke's tail wagged, unconcerned with his own heroism. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from Jasmine sent for the first time in weeks. "Hey, I heard Corinne moved, wanted to make sure you're okay. Also, Victoria says hello from her probation officer. She's doing well. I'm trying to rebuild things with her. Thought you should know." Marcus texted back, "I'm glad. Tell her I said good luck." He meant it. He'd found to his surprise that he didn't carry anger about Victoria's break-in attempt. She'd been an instrument of the same forces that had driven Corinne to his pool: desperation, family dynamics, the need to help someone you love even when that help is harmful. She'd learned her lesson and was serving her time. That was enough. His therapist had said in their last session that he was finally learning to live instead of just surviving. Marcus wasn't sure he agreed, but he was working on it. The doorbell rang. Marcus went inside and opened the front door to find a man he didn't recognize, 50-ish, distinguished, holding a bottle of very nice wine. "Marcus Chen?" the man asked. "Yes." "I'm David Whitmore, Corinne's ex-husband. I wanted to apologize to you in person for what my marital chaos has put you through." Marcus was too surprised to do anything but invite him in. They stood in the kitchen, and David explained. He'd been seeing his lawyer about the divorce settlement, and Corinne's lawyer had mentioned that David should probably reach out to the neighbor whose property had been violated in pursuit of Corinne's mental breakdown. David had taken that as a wake-up call, not to reconcile with Corinne, but to understand the damage his affair had caused to people he'd never even met. "Jasmine told me about the break-in attempt," David said. "About her sister and the security footage. I realized that probably wouldn't have happened if Corinne hadn't been in crisis, if I hadn't created the circumstances that led to her crisis." "That's not really your fault," Marcus said. "Corinne made her own choice to come over here." "She did," David agreed. "But I set in motion the events that led her to make that choice. I think about that now in my relationship with Jasmine, and I wonder what I'm creating, what damage I'm causing by my actions. It's not a comfortable thing to contemplate." They talked for an hour. David told Marcus about his affair, about his realization that he'd been trying to run from his own failures by pursuing someone younger, about his attempt at a relationship with Jasmine that was already failing because it was built on the foundation of mutual infidelity, about his plan to get into therapy and actually work on himself instead of continuing to damage everyone around him. When he left, he'd given Marcus the bottle of wine and a genuine apology that didn't erase anything but did offer a kind of closure. That evening, Marcus sat on his patio and opened the wine. He drank a glass while watching the sun set, and he thought about the strange geometry of human interaction, how one person's crisis could ripple outward and affect people they'd never even meant to hurt, how Corinne's decision to trespass had prevented Victoria's burglary, how David's affair had set all of these dominoes in motion, how Duke's alertness had been the thing that turned accident into providence. His phone rang, unknown number. He considered not answering, then picked up anyway. "Hi, Marcus, this is Karen. I hope it's not weird that I'm calling. I'm at my new place. It's right on the coast, like I said I wanted. And I was remembering the first time I came to swim in your pool, and I thought about how that's the kind of kindness that changes a person. So I wanted to tell you that you changed my life. Not in a grand way, but in a real way. By not pressing charges. By letting me swim in your pool. By treating me like I was a person worth saving instead of just the terrible neighbor who'd made your life difficult." "You're welcome," Marcus said. "I'm glad you're doing better." "I am," Karen said. "I'm in a 12-step program for emotional abuse recovery. I'm volunteering at a women's shelter. I'm learning to be the kind of person who builds other people up instead of tearing them down, and it started that night when I fell into your empty pool." After they hung up, Marcus sat with this thought. His pool, which was meant to be a space of beauty and tranquility, had become instead a space of transformation. Not in the way he'd intended. It wasn't the swimming and the exercise and the summer entertainment. It was the accident and the trespass and the breaking point that had led to someone choosing to become better. Life, Marcus realized, didn't work the way he'd always tried to construct it. It wasn't orderly or predictable. It was full of accidents and collisions and moments where one person's worst choice became another person's opportunity for grace. He finished his wine and went inside, where Duke was already asleep on the couch, a breach of the house rules that Marcus had long ago stopped enforcing. He scratched the dog's ear and said, "We did okay, didn't we, buddy?" Duke's tail thumped against the cushion in agreement. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the sounds of his neighborhood, birds, the distant sound of traffic, a neighbor mowing their lawn. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life. He made coffee and went out to the patio with his laptop. He had work to do, a client was waiting on a proposal, but he found himself sitting instead, just looking at his pool in the morning light. He thought about Karen's first visit to the pool after her injury. He thought about the lightness in her expression as she'd floated on her back in the shallow end, finally feeling like she was safe. He thought about how a terrible thing had led to something better, and how that particular alchemy of suffering and redemption was the most human thing of all. His phone buzzed, a text from a number labeled Marcus's mom, which meant his mother was checking in from Hong Kong where she'd relocated for her new job. "How are you, sweetheart? Are you eating enough? Are you dating anyone? Have you made new friends? Call your mother." Marcus smiled and texted back that he'd call her that weekend. He had a lot to tell her. As he sat on the patio, sipping his coffee, watching the light change across his pool, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Not happiness, exactly, but contentment. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had survived something difficult and come out the other side transformed. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of purpose after all. And sometimes, he thought, that purpose arrived in the form of a neighbor trespassing in your backyard and falling into an empty pool. Sometimes, redemption arrived in the most unexpected ways. 1 year later, Marcus stood in his backyard during a neighborhood block party that he'd organized. The event had been Karen's idea. She texted him from her new place on the coast, suggesting that perhaps the neighborhood could use some community building, some genuine connection between people who'd been living in isolated proximity for too long. Marcus had surprised himself by not just agreeing to the idea, but by proposing to his neighbors that they hold it in his backyard, around his pool. Everyone had accepted the invitation. Even Tom Hendricks, the neighbor who'd owned the property that Victoria had used to access Marcus's yard. Even the HOA president. Even the mailman who Karen had been rude to years ago, who came with his wife and his kids and seemed like genuinely nice people when you actually spent time talking to them. David was there too, though not with Jasmine. Their relationship had ended quietly after about 6 months, which nobody was particularly surprised by. He'd come to the party because the invitation had been public, and because he was trying to learn how to exist in his community in a way that wasn't predatory or harmful. "This is nice," someone said to Marcus as he stood near the grill, watching the sun set over his pool. It was the yoga instructor who Karen had complained to. "I heard Karen used to be kind of awful to you. I'm glad you two worked it out." "We did," Marcus said. "It took falling into an empty pool and a few months of therapy, but yeah, we worked it out." The woman laughed, thinking he was joking. Duke moved through the crowd, receiving attention and treats from people who'd only known him as that dog who barked too much. He seemed pleased to be reclassified as a neighborhood hero. By the time the party wound down and the sun had fully set, Marcus was left with the satisfaction of having created something, not just a beautiful pool or a carefully maintained garden, but a community, a space where people could connect, a place where the accident of geography could become the foundation for genuine relationship. As he helped his guests leave and began cleaning up, Marcus thought about how his life had changed in the span of a single evening. How Karen's crisis had set off a chain of events that had led him to therapy, to self-reflection, to the decision that he wanted to live his life in connection with others rather than isolation from them. He thought about how the worst moment of his life, discovering that someone had been planning to rob him, had paradoxically been the thing that had forced him to open up his carefully constructed boundaries. He thought about how one person's pain could become another person's opportunity, and how redemption often arrived in the most unexpected packages. By the time midnight rolled around, Marcus was standing alone by his pool, looking at his reflection in the water. Duke was asleep at his feet, exhausted from a day of socializing. "You know what, Duke," Marcus said to the sleeping dog, "I think we're going to be okay." Duke's tail thumped once against the ground, a final affirmation before sleep pulled him deeper under. Marcus finished cleaning up, turned off the pool lights, and went inside to his house, his beautiful, ordinary, perfect house, where a new chapter of his life was already beginning to be written.